Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first live from NYPL of 2023. Thank you so much for being here. I can't really see your faces, but it's a delight to sort of see all these beautiful faces in this room, and to all of the people watching online as well. Just thank you so much for being with us and taking some of your time out of your day to be here tonight. My name is Aiden Flax-Clark, and I'm part of the team that brings you live from NYPL, so I'm just entirely grateful for this evening. It's my honor to introduce tonight's speakers. David Wright Faladé and Ilyon are the authors of two recent remarkable books, Black Cloud Rising and Master Slave Husband Wife. And they will be speaking with none other than Pulitzer Prize winning playwright and screenwriter Lynn Nottage. Yes, give it up. I think it's what they call a powerhouse trio. Black Cloud Rising is a fictionalized account of the very real African Brigade, a Civil War unit largely composed of formerly enslaved men who, for a brief period, hunted down Confederates for the Union Army. And Master Slave Husband Wife retells the story of William and Ellen Craft, a couple who escaped slavery, with Ellen passing as a wealthy disabled man and William posing as his slave. Fun fact, Lynn Nottage also happens to be writing about the Crafts for her forthcoming film, Everlasting Yea. I'd also like to recognize that we have two descendants of the Crafts here with us tonight, two of their great-great-grandchildren. David and Ilyon's books are, first of all, absolutely riveting page-turners. I mean, pure delights to read. But thinking of them in the context of Black History Month, which of course we are in the middle of, they also narrate intimate episodes in Black history, which is to say in American history, that cause us to confront the peculiar, protean, and troubled nature of the word freedom in this country, a word that has never had the same meaning for all of us. The books remind us that it's never been quite as easy as liberty for all, and that, unfortunately, it was true in 1848, it was true in 1863, and with the murder of Tyree Nichols and far too many events, it remains true in 2023. On the less upsetting front, let's say that you read Ilyon and David's books and you want to learn more. We have some amazing things in our collections connected to these books. I looked up in the catalog this morning, and the Crafts account of their escape, you can read the first edition at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. If you want to learn more about General Wild, the leader of the African Brigade, you can read his autobiography here in this building, published in 1895. And what do you need for that? Just your library card, which everybody has. All right, I guess I believe you. The other thing you can do with your library card is check out David and Ilyon's books. And if you so desire, you can also purchase them. They're over for sale right there. And David and Ilyon will sign them right over there after the event. So if you can, I really encourage you because they're just both incredible, incredible books. Couple other bits of housekeeping and then we'll get to it. This is the first live of 2023. There are many, many more to come. Just in the weeks ahead, we will have Kimon Felix, the Lenape Center, Titus Kaphar and Dwayne Betts, Emma Smith, Meredith Broussard, and many, many more. And we are bringing back one of our best events, the Library After Hours, on March 31st. We like to call it the city's most cerebral happy hour. We'll be celebrating Women's History Month. It's March 31st, and it is so fun. Please come. For all of those, you can go to nypl.org/live. You can register. You should get on our newsletter to find out what else is coming up. And I hope I see you at every single one. And I will check if you have your library card if I run into you. Okay, last thing, you may have seen note cards on your chairs. Those are for asking questions. Write them down anytime. People will come by to pick them up. I really encourage you to write questions on those note cards. And if you are watching online, you can put them in the chat, and or you can email publicprograms@nypl.org. We'll bring them up to the speakers, and they will get to as many as they can at the end. Lastly, Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos and Manaz Isbahani Bartos and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you here, our wonderful supporters. So thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for being here. And please, let's join me in welcoming Lynn Nottage, David Wright Faladé, and Ilyon Wu.
Hello, how's everyone? Yay. I'm really happy to be here because I get to be in conversation with these two people who've both written remarkable books that are also in conversation with each other. They both deal with a fascinating, fraught, and woefully underexplored part of American history. And I thought we'd just dive in with the first question. Ilyon, who were William and Ellen Craft?
So thank you it's wonderful to be here at the New York Public Library and to be in conversation with both of you about these amazing people. And I'll start with William and Ellen. So the Crafts were an enslaved couple who, on a cold winter morning just before Christmas in 1848, they rise at 4 in the morning, and they are about to embark on the most extraordinary journeys of mutual self-emancipation in American history. So on this morning, they take all these elements of a costume that Ellen will put on, a shirt, a jacket, a vest, boots, and hats, and she disguises herself as an enslaver, while William will play the role of her slave. And he cuts her hair. That's the last thing they do before they're about to leave. And they leave on this cold morning in Macon, and they're going to journey 1,000 miles, at least 1,000 miles to their freedom. So this is their story, but the 1,000 miles are just the beginning.
And so for 1,000 miles, how did they travel?
They traveled, well, it wasn't supposed to be that difficult. It was actually supposed to be like, a couple express stops, and they get lots of things happen on the way. But this isn't one of those stories of emancipation where they're hiding or, going underground. There is no underground railroad that goes this far in Georgia. They are going above ground on steamers and on omnibuses and on a real overland railroad, many of the tracks laid by enslaved people. So this is an out in the open, brazen journey.
I was so curious, in reading your book, there's a portion where you talk about what inspired Ellen in particular to take this journey, because it is sort of inconceivable at the moment that they would do something so bold, so brave, and unexpected.
Mm-hmm. And so dangerous. I mean, William was a skilled carpenter and an artisan, and Ellen also was a seamstress, and they had relatively what are considered high positions in their worlds, and they had that to lose, each other, potentially their lives. I mean, everything was on the line for them to make this escape. So yes, the reasons are complex, as you know, I'm sure, from having looked into this. But the first reason that they start with, and I think it's amazing to think that we have descendants today who are living out this legacy, what they ran for. They ran for posterity. They ran for their children, for the children they one day wanted to have. They ran so that their children would not experience the trauma of the separation and the pain that they endured as children themselves. So that's a big part, I think, of why they ran.
And I want to ask you a question, David. You know, your book is really rich, and I had the experience when I was reading it, is that it's very visceral. It feels as though you literally were there as you were writing this book, and it centers around Richard Etheridge, who was a biracial, formerly enslaved man who ends up fighting with the African Brigade during the Civil War. And I just wonder, what drew you to this particular character? Because this is not the first time you've written about him. This is the second time.
Yeah. My first book, Fire on the Beach, which was a narrative history, I wrote about Etheridge, and much of that focused on his later life when he was in the forerunner of the Coast Guard. And there was a lot of documentation. When I wrote it with a friend, David Zobe, and when we first started doing research, it seemed clear. There were just things that were clear in the backstory, but that were either they had been, they had been changed over the course of history, but that went back into slavery. And so a part of me wanted to understand the slavery part of it in a way that I couldn't quite get at, because on the one hand, the record that remained, again, had sort of shifted, had been changed. He was said to have been possibly half Native American and half black, all these things that had happened in that small community as a way to not sort of face the fact that he was very likely the son of his master. But also, given that he was a slave, that part of the story, there wasn't a lot of documentation. So we couldn't tell the story as well in Fire on the Beach, that part of it. Couldn't delve as well. I am not nearly the historian that you are, so.
And so where did you first encounter this story?
It was happenstance. I'd lived abroad in England and France in my 20s, and I came back to go to grad school, and I was in Virginia. And David Zobe, who had grown up in Tidewater, Virginia, and spent a lot of time in the Outer Banks, it was like first-year grad students, and we were at like a first-year grad student party, sort of everybody's disgruntled, and we're trying to have fun, and it's not very easy. And Zobe asked me if I'd ever heard of the P Island Lifesavers, and I'm like, I have no idea. This is 1992. And he starts talking about it. He describes the Outer Banks and this and that. And at that point, I didn't even know where the Outer Banks were. And it's like, 150 miles away from where we were. So I went to the library and I started doing a little bit of research. At that point, there's no Google or whatever. So like in the index cards and just very little had been written. It was clear the story was really rich from the beginning, and not much had been told. So even though he was a first-year poet and I was a first-year fiction writer, it was clear that we wanted to try to do something with it. We had no idea what, but yeah.
Yeah, so that's how. And so I want to get back to William and Ellen Craft just for a moment, because we know their story in part because they wrote a self-emancipation narrative, and they became prominent abolitionists. And so I was wondering, after they landed in Philadelphia, and it was in December, it was cold. They'd probably never experienced that kind of cold. How did they negotiate this new space? Where did they get their money? Where did they, get their coats? I'm just curious about what happens when you step for the first time into a space in which you get to fully explore your freedom, and you've never experienced that before.
That's a great question, and you're right about the cold. The first thing, they're actually planning to go to Canada in the beginning, and the abolitionists are like, oh, you don't want to go there. It's like really cold.
Oh, no.
Yeah. What happens to them is their story really picks up, like from the minute they land in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, they're still not safe. Even though they've crossed the Mason-Dixon line, they could be seized at any time by law. And then, so they're kind of laying low. They're in Pennsylvania thinking about going to Boston. And then, like, I mean, you can just see him dancing onto the stage. In comes Mr. William Wells Brown. So he's another self-emancipated man. So they're actually been dealing with other black activists who were not enslaved before. But here's a man who knows their story, who knows how to tell a story, who is a best-selling author, great performer and lecturer, and he knows a good story when he hears one. So he wants to hear the story from themselves, and when then he hears that story, he knows this is going to make a great show. And so he invites them. And that's like one of the big first choices they made. What are they going to be called? Where are they going to go, and how are they going to live? They don't change their names. They don't go to Canada. They don't disappear and really start over. They move more than 1,000 miles, zigzagging all the way across New England, telling their story with Brown. And it puts them in terrible danger.
And why do you think they didn't disguise themselves at that moment? Why do you think they felt it was important for the world to know exactly who they were? Because I know that their story traveled back to Macon, which put them in real jeopardy, and yet they were willing to take that risk in order to tell their story.
Yeah, well, I think always if they were moving forward in time in order to try to have a family that would be free, they had at their backs the memory of those they left behind. We know because Ellen, both of them, they tried to reconnect with their family members and bring them out of bondage. And so they made this journey not only for their own freedom, but for all these others. And that's what they were speaking on behalf. They were speaking for. And actually, I was thinking about a connection with your story, because there are ways in which, there's an information revolution going on at this time. There's the telegraph, and news is moving across the country as never before. And I feel like they use that.
Right.
So they're telling these stories, they're getting reported, they're going down to Macon. And we have evidence from newspapers that enslaved people are actually hearing and even having these stories read to them. And that's something I noticed in your book, too, where there's word being traveled through letters, oftentimes through people who you don't expect to be the conveyors of the information.
Yeah, the newspaper is a big part of both of these stories. And just listening to you speak, I imagine that there was a certain level of protection that was afforded the crafts by making their story so public. Like you said, they were hiding in plain sight. Is that the abolitionists really rallied around them, in part because they were such a powerful tool in the movement, and the newspapers were used to amplify their story. And you have a character in your book who's a journalist from the New York Times who plays not a dissimilar role, because I guess the only way in which to get the word out at that time was via newspapers. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you chose to take that white character and place him in the midst of this black regiment.
Given that I wrote it as fiction, I could have chosen to actually take him out, but Tewksbury actually existed.
Okay.
If you Google Tewksbury and some keywords for that raid, when I cite the article in the novel, it's almost in every instance fairly word for word.
Wow.
And on some level it was Wild, General Wild, this abolitionist commander who raised the regiment and was, super appropriately named. He just had this, mission in mind, and he was going to attain it any way he could. And so I don't know this. I'm imagining this is how it took place, but he invited Tewksbury along to go on the sortie, the raid. So Tewksbury was there the whole time. Again, in a few instances, I tweaked his words. One thing about the communication that's happening and how slaves are aware, too, one thing that struck me, certainly true in the Outer Banks, which is this small community, but largely, I alwast imagine that slaves knew a lot more than folks thought anyway, right?
Yes.
Because they're overhearing.
Right.
They're deliberately overhearing. It's an act of pushing back, of rebellion, of resistance to be knowledgeable in this world where you are not allowed to learn to read and write and whatever. And so I feel like, and as I was reading your book, it just struck me that not just, the stories are coming back through the newspaper, but once they are back into the white community, the black community has it too, right?
Yeah, that's it. I guess it will segue into this notion of critical fabulation, which was coined by Saidiya Hartman, where she was really talking about sort of the absence of information in the archive based on people who've been disappeared or diminished. And so in order for us to understand who they are, we have to do some speculation and we have to do some creative work. And when you were sitting down to write your book, and knowing that Richard Etheridge is a real person, I wonder why you chose to write it as a novel as opposed to a piece of nonfiction. And also, the second part of that question is I wonder about the language that you used, because a lot of it is not in what you would say sort of traditional Geechee dialect.
Great question, thank you. So in working on Fire on the Beach, like I said, the Coast Guard part of it, the early Coast Guard part of it was there in the documentation. The thing that was unusual is that we were told, Zoe and I were told initially that there was no documentation. The Outer Bankers are poor record keepers, this, that, and whatever. And, you know, we were a first-year poet and a first-year fiction writer, and we believed people. But as soon as we started looking, we stumbled on all this documentation. We ended up finding the logs. They were supposed to be in the National Archives, but the National Archives had decentralized, and so they were in the Atlanta branch. We just found this great documentation. But and part of what really drew me to Richard Etheridge's story was his stories, particularly, and that part of it, there were indications of things, but we just couldn't say it with a certain authority. And so I didn't know that I would write it as fiction, but I knew I wanted to come back to certain stories. And this one really, when I stumbled upon it, when I first stumbled upon the story of this 3-week sortie when Richard Etheridge was in the Civil War, when we first started doing research, there was nobody knew that he had been in the Civil War. Or nobody knew. People may have known, but it wasn't in the record in any way. So when I stumbled upon this story about this 3-week sortie, I immediately thought Glory. I remember when Glory first came out, and it's a wonderful movie, but I was shocked by it in certain ways. On the one hand, it's Matthew Broderick's story. So that struck me. But I also was really struck by one scene in particular, if y'all remember that movie, when they go to Darien, Georgia, you know, the very sort of Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington, you know, the 54th is there in, you know, blue tunics and blue pants, and they're very dignified. But there's a unit of formerly enslaved people that is also there. And they're wearing sort of red pants and blue tops, and they look a little bit more minstrel-like. They can't march. At one point, I had to Google the script to verify that my memory wasn't wrong, but at one point, one of those soldiers goes to his white commander and says, something like, Massa, me fire musket? I mean, it literally is minstrelsy. And I'm like, these are slaves who yesterday were working sun up to sundown, gang labor, certainly knew what a gun was, probably knew how to fire it. And so I felt like that part of the story, and Glory is a great movie, so I don't mean to disparage Glory. It was an important movie, but I felt like there was a piece of the record that wasn't there. So when I stumbled on it with Fire on the Beach, I knew I wanted to retell that story. And because I wanted to explore Richard Etheridge and all his complexity, and I couldn't, I'm not a good enough historian to do it any other way, fiction just seemed like the way to go. And the last piece, I'm starting to ramble, but the voice part of it, if y'all have ever been to the Outer Banks and you hear older bankers, when Zoe and I first started, we were told there were no documentations, but there were a lot of elderly people who were still alive, not from 1880, but their children. So the children of these lifesavers from the 1880s were still alive, had been born in 1907 and 1915, and we're interviewing them. And this was true also with white Outer Bankers. There's a distinct way of speaking that is very specific to the Outer Banks, in part because before they built bridges in the 1930s, it's super isolated. And so I always had that in my head, and one person in particular, William C. Bowser, and he just had this distinctive way of speaking. And so when I first started trying to hear Richard Etheridge's voice, it just came out, and a lot of it was very close to William C. Bowser's. It's just this, it's not like you would get just a little bit further south, down in the, you know, Gullah Islands and things like that. It's closer to Elizabethan English than it is.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's distinctive. Yeah.
And can I put a similar question to you? But when we were sitting in the green room, you mentioned that you had written a draft of this book, and then you completely rewrote it. And you found sort of the vocabulary of the book in the rewrite. So I was wondering whether you could talk about that.
Well, I can I can talk about one part of it, because the rewrite, it was very painful. My editor, Dawn Davis, is here, and she was like, she told me I was writing a scholarly tomb, like burying people and all the details, and so I won't go into that. But I mean, this question that you raise is so important, and you're citing Saidiya Hartman. I would cite also William Wells Brown, because he says, about slavery, because he's honest, he's being asked to talk about slavery as it is by this ladies' anti-slavery society. And what he says to them, because there's genuine concern and interest on their part, but there's also kind of a level of voyeurism, too, that he picks up on.
Yeah.
And so he says, if I were really to tell you what slavery is like, I would, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, I would take you one at a time and I would whisper it to you. Slavery has never been represented, and slavery can never be represented. So there's this question of how do you represent the unrepresentable? And I put that, actually, when I was rewriting, I put that quotation front and center in my workspace as a reminder. Because I'm writing nonfiction, I can't make anything up. And there are things, I'll give you one example. Ellen Craft, so Ellen Craft's first enslaver was her biological father. And this man had a wife who was so enraged by the sight of Ellen and her resemblance to her biological father that she gave Ellen away as a wedding gift as soon as she possibly could. So when Ellen was 11 years old, she was separated from her family members, from her mother. It turns out we have a tremendous amount of information available about this woman, Mistress Smith. And it turns out that you can actually squeeze those records for the information that we need. About Ellen and her mother. But what I wanted to do was I didn't want this woman to be a caricature, because there's so many of these women. I mean, she's not just like the evil stepmother character. She was a real person who had choices that she made, and I wanted that as much as possible to come alive. But what ended up happening was the more I told of her, the more it became apparent that I didn't, for example, have that kind of information about Maria, Ellen's mother. And I was, in trying to address that balance, I can't make up a story for Maria. I can't give her the things that we have for Mr. Smith. We know where Mr. Smith was buried. We know what she ate and where she went to church and all these kinds of things. So to go from sentence to paragraph to chapter to give Ellen Craft and her mother the ownership of the story, to tilt the axis of the story so it wraps around Ellen.
Well, I thought you did a beautiful job of teasing out the archive, and in particular giving real dimension to Ellen and giving her back some ownership of the story. Because at the time, I think a lot of people felt that William was driving the bus. He was the one who encouraged them to run. He was the one who wrote, Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom, and that she was his sidekick. But what I think was really apparent in reading this book is that she was a woman with agency and was really part of shaping their destiny. I wanted to circle back to something. You're talking about this quote from William Wells Brown, and I guess this is a question for both of you, and I think about it a lot in my own work, is that when you're dealing with really difficult material and subject matter that is traumatizing, it's like, how do you write about it in ways that don't re-traumatize? How do you dig into some of these things, which I feel are really necessary for us to know and understand? And this is, a bigger conversation we're having in the nation, is what do we expose people to in order for people to understand what the truth is?
I mean, I feel like, to paraphrase James Baldwin, we have to look in a truthful mirror. And so even if it is difficult and even if it is traumatizing, I feel like we have to look at it as truthfully as possible. And so that, for me, is a driving impetus. But at the same time, I feel like part of the way that we do that, and echoing just what you said, Ilyon, it's not in making caricatures of the villains, right? they are complex people too. It's trying to understand them. And in getting at the complexity of all these various characters, the various people who had, differing experiences and points of view, then I think we start to get at a truth that becomes digestible. Maybe it doesn't taste good, but we can sort of, So, and I think that's important.
And I think especially with fiction, I mean, you can't do this with nonfiction, but with fiction, you can create new truths. And I wonder if I may pay homage to a scene that I especially admired in your book. So I have to say, so I consider myself a recovering academic, but this book is so rich that you can just see all the Post-its I wrote on the first page, there's a mouthful of language here. I can taste the words. I better slow down and savor. That was my own note to myself. But there was the scene that really changed me. Is the scene? This is a scene where you depict the African Brigade, as they're known, going to the space of an enslaver, and so there's a meeting of justice where the positions are reversed, and a formerly enslaved person is in charge of physically punishing a former enslaver, a longtime enslaver, and a brutal one who had just, talk about atrocities and the unspeakable, who had inflicted this unspeakable pain. And what moved me in your telling of this is how, I talked about this before, about how you change on the level of the sentence, on the grammar of how you can turn these things upside down. When you're describing this physical punishment, first of all, the person who's in charge now, his name is Revere. So first of all, you've given the action to somebody whose name is a verb. And in this paragraph, almost all the sentences begin with Revere. Revere is the subject. And the person he's punishing, you don't name him in that paragraph. He is the direct object. You have used the grammar of your paragraph to reverse that order. And then it goes even deeper, because then you give the floor, you give the whip, the instrument, to a woman who has been punished and who's been voiceless for so long. And I won't describe exactly what happens. You have to read the story to get that. But the part that really just made me sort of stop in my tracks is, by the end of this man, this direct object, this enslaver, who's been reduced by his pain now to just one sentence. And what he says is, "Jenny, Jenny, oh please." And in that moment, I just kind of stood up and I was like, first of all, this is a rewriting of Roots. You talked about glory, but that moment where Kunta Kinte is saying, "Toby, my name is Toby," you've redone that, you've revised that. And then it made me think, you, Mr. Faladé, have reached back through time and space, and you are making this man say her name.
Thank you. I'm really flattered. Thank you.
So, thank you for that moment.
Oh, yeah.
I won't forget it.
No, I'm honored. I don't know what to say. Thank you. And I always
That was beautiful.
have something to say.
I guess I could do a follow-up question to that. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Revere and Richard? Because they are polar opposites, and there's something very specific you were getting at, and I just want you to speak to that.
So in writing the story, I got really, really lucky, which is to say, every time I would be like, I need a plot point, I'd sort of flip through old notes, and there would be something from the history. So that whipping scene actually happened. As they're marching through the Great Dismal Swamp, again, not a lot happens. I'm like, I need something, and I'm flipping through Smithsonian Magazine, and I read about the Maroon colonies. So it was just, the history itself was really, really rich. But with that said, all the characters in the novel were actual people. I mean, I'm fictionalizing them with some like Wilde and Draper and Etheridge. I know enough about their history that I have a notion of who I think they were in history. But even minor characters were actual soldiers, except for Revere. Revere, I felt like I needed sort of like that photo image negative of Richard. also biracial, also the son of his master, but his experience has been really different, and so his reaction is really different.
Right.
And those two playing off each other was really important. And so I just invented this sergeant who would be the doppelganger of Richard. Yeah.
Which created a beautiful tension.
Hopefully, yeah. Yeah.
So I wanted to get back to Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. And I have to say, when I first read it, I have a really complicated relationship with that book. One, because of sort of the heightened way in which it's written, is that the language doesn't feel like the William that I've come to know through research. And it feels in ways like propaganda, even though there is an intimacy to it, but it feels as though it's also omitting a great deal. And I was wondering, when you were reading that, what your relationship was, and what do you think about the veracity of that particular narrative?
Well, it's interesting that the voice also, there is a very sort of performance kind of quality to that voice, and he uses, I say he because the voice is...
It's Williams.
It's credited to William, and it's told from William's point of view. Now most scholars are crediting both William and Ellen because they're writing about things or describing things that only she could have seen, so she has to have been part of that experience. But, so there's irony and there's humor, there's all sorts of play on the surface of it, but then there's a profound level of pain that's expressed too, especially when he's talking about his family and his separation from his sister, who he sees sold away from him on the auction block. And so those two kind of parts of the voices coming together, I felt like I could really feel that. I could hear it as I was. It's a text that almost demands to be read aloud, I feel. But what I found actually surprising about this story was how many of the details actually you can find archival evidence for. For example, they talk about how they get to Charleston and they think, all right, Charleston, we just take one more steamer and we're in Philadelphia. But it turns out that line shut down. And they mentioned that the fugitive had been caught aboard one of the last ships out. And I found evidence of that man named Moses, who had a failed attempt to box himself up and have himself mailed or shipped. So there are all these little alignments, but then there are the big questions or the big silences having to do with what their experiences were in bondage. There's a lot that they either cannot or will not tell.
And so how did you piece that together?
So I dug like frantically in the archives. I mean, I really tried to retrace the journey physically and cover as much space that I could. And I was really surprised at some of the material that came up. For example, when I went to Macon, Georgia, I was curious as to whether there was any evidence of that Ellen being given away by her biological father. And one of the first things I found in this giant courthouse in Macon, and they let me upstairs. They just let me upstairs, and I had free reign of all these things. And I was flipping through, and I found there was a page in this beautiful script with horrible meaning, by which James Smith says, "For the love that he bears for his daughter, Eliza, he's going to give her this property."
Oh, so you found it.
Yes. So those are the moments that start to bring these things alive. And when I read William's mortgage, for example, you see the things that he's mortgaged with. And in these moments in the archives, I began to be able to put together that bigger picture.
And so a question for both of you, as you were combing through the archives, and both of you seem like you did a meticulous and very thorough job, were there surprises, things that took you in a different direction, or things that you thought, oh my God, this is really going to change how I approach telling this story?
Not in that way, which is to say, as somebody who isn't trained in doing that sort of research at all, You know, again, when I began doing the research, I was a first-year fiction writer, graduate student. So it was all discovery. It was sort of learning how to do it.
Right.
And so everything that I was stumbling upon, and a lot of times it was really luck stumbling upon stuff, was just discovery. The one thing that I think sort of kept driving me along was like the ignorance sort of kept driving me along. I just understood myself to be really bad at what I was doing. So if I keep going, and so I ended up in small archives where you just wouldn't expect, and sometimes you'd find these wonderful things. But everything was, it was a blank slate. There was so little about
Right.
Richard Etheridge that everything was new, you know.
So everything was a revelation.
Everything. One awesome thing that happened when we finally discovered the logbooks, we were down in Atlanta, and there were these big logbooks, military-style books. And as I was opening 2 pages, they were stuck together, and as I pulled them apart, there was a bumblebee stuck in there. It was from 1890, and it disintegrated as I pulled the pages apart. That was pretty cool.
What about you?
Well, I mean, for me, the discoveries were just left and right. I mean, it was just like I kept feeling like I was like, you know, entering an entirely different space, like a whole nother dimension, like really like a mystery solving. I mean, everything from, you know, the Crafts. William names Mr. Craft as his enslaver, but doesn't give too many details. Being able to find Mr. Craft, Mr. Hugh Craft, I almost like fell out of my chair, you know, or even small things like late in the journey, I was at the National Archives and I found so there's this big crisis in Boston where William and Ellen are hiding and they're slave hunters coming after them, and there's all these different people looking for them, and the marshal has hired this watchman, this night watchman, to sort of spy and look for where William is. And so I found his testimony. Oh. And first of all, I don't know why they hired this guy, because he's like, I'll take this job, but my priorities are A, I don't want to get hurt, and 2, like I don't want to work too long. So I'm like, so little things, big things, I mean, it was continual for me.
And so one of I think the most fascinating parts of the Craft journey is after the Fugitive Slave Act, in which they realize that their lives are once again in jeopardy and that they're going to have to flee. But what's fascinating about it is just how public their fight to protect themselves was. And also these 2 bumbling guys who had come up north to find them.
Yeah, I mean, the guys from Macon, so they supposedly wanted to start a bucket making business, and one of them was actually, he had a pretty terrible role in Macon. He'd been the Macon jailer, and it was said that he had been responsible for whipping Ellen's uncle nearly to death. Mm-hmm. So, you know, these were serious people with serious intentions. But when they come up to Boston, you know, they're a 20-minute walk away. I mean, I've walked this distance myself. Even on a really cold Boston day, you can do it in less than 20 minutes. They're just on the other side of the common, and they get I started mapping them all over the place, where are the hunters and where are the crafts, and they get at one point they're like a rifle shot away from each other. So there's all this sort of frantic back and forth, but these guys, you know, if they thought it would be easy to come and get warrants and have the whole city behind the craft, but behind them, they were absolutely wrong.
I think I have time just for one more question before we take questions from the audience. But as a playwright, this is a question that I'm really curious about, and it's sort of one of my hypotheses that the very first form of American theater is the self-emancipated narrative. That these narratives were written by people like the Crafts and Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown, who incidentally wrote the very first play written by an African American, and it was about Ellen Craft.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is, and she's sort of loosely disguised, but it's so clear that it's the Craft story. And I just wonder, and either of you can answer this question, in how do you think the narratives of sort of the self-emancipated affected American literature, and in particular, sort of storytelling?
It's a great question. I think, like, in the case of Richard Etheridge, clearly he is doing what he's doing, for freedom, him, his family, his people, all that. But part of what they're also asserting, it strikes me, and I really felt this way as I was reading the craft story in your book. They're also sort of saying, I am fully American. It's not just I am free, I am fully American. And I think in doing that, because the narratives that had been given them about who they were in the world, how slaves were described, so it's not just that, white people are being told this and that and whatever about what a black person is. Black people are receiving this too. They're not believing it, but they're receiving it. And I think there's this profound understanding that we need to take hold of the narrative. We need to define ourselves. And so that's some of what's happening, I think.
I mean, I think in terms of literature, it's been said, I think Theodore Parker, the rebel preacher, might have been one of the earlier people to say that the American slave narrative, fugitive slave narrative, is like the truly original, first, only real American narrative. But what impresses me about these stories is how they seem to exist in multiple dimensions. So there is that quality of like that these are told stories, but then also you have people like William Wells Brown and Douglass and the Crafts going on the road and telling their stories. So then there's like a whole nother performing dimension. William Wells Brown and Henry Box Brown performed with giant panoramas, and Henry Box Brown even had like musicians going along with them, so they would light up these enormous picture paintings that would take up the whole stage, and they light them up piece by piece and narrate. So there would be like a visual dimension of it, there was a spoken and a musical dimension of it. These are stories that are all encompassing, multimedia, like early performance art experiences that I think are like models for performance today.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. And thank you. Now I think we'll take some questions from the audience. The first question is, what did you each learn about yourselves during the process of crafting or telling these particular stories?
Well, this is a roundabout answer, and I hope it's an answer to the question. But it was actually pointed out to me by Cressida Lation, who's wonderful, wonderful editor. An excerpt of this, of the Black Cloud Rising came out in the New Yorker, and there was an interview, and we were talking, and at one point she made this connection between Richard Etheridge, him dealing with his biracial identity, and sort of me as a biracial person. And it's dumb to say, but it was like a V8 moment. I was like, until that moment, I had no idea that in writing about Richard Etheridge, on some level, I'm writing about myself. I mean, he was much more important in a gabillion ways than me, but the exploration of that was a part of it, and it took an outside eye to sort of...
Personally, sort of spiritually, definitely artistically, I mean, from that first moment when Don Davis wrote that six-page letter explaining why my book didn't work, I really had to dig deep and look into just everything. So I was looking at films, I was looking at music, I was looking at like cooking, I was like everything I could draw from. I mean, and I think actually sports training can sort of tie into this too. It forced me to write without a plan and cook without a recipe, which is something I really wanted to do. I wanted to follow there was no outlining here. And I actually, the way I wrote my way through this ultimately was to write the whole book in verse. That, I don't know how or why I guess it worked because I felt like the paragraph structure, again, if we're talking about the grammar of how we express the unrepresentable, I felt like the paragraph structure was confining. So what I ended up doing, instead of leading with the footnotes and leading with the research, which got me in trouble in the first place, is I sat down, I tried to put all that aside, and just like sitting at a keyboard, write these one line at a time and really and speak it. And say it and then eventually sort of unhook those to form paragraphs. But so this is like a much more spontaneous, improvisational way of writing than I'd ever known before.
Did hearing it aloud impact
Yes.
upon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So the next question is regarding re-traumatization, voyeurism. When telling these stories that deal with sensitive pieces of history, how do you keep yourself grounded, and who do you write for?
Wow, these are really rich, difficult questions.
Well, I can say that having written plays that deal with very difficult subject matter, one of the things that we did, I wrote a play, Ruined, which was about gender-specific human rights abuses, and these actors had to go on stage and perform these hideous acts 8 times a week, and we discussed a lot, like how do we take care of ourselves when we go into spaces in which we may be dealing with old wounds or discovering new wounds. And one of the things that we did was say, I love you, to each other after each performance, and look each other in the eyes and say, you are not this character. You don't have to hold this in your body. And so I guess that's baked into this question.
With Fire on the Beach and Black Cloud Rising, I mentioned it, part of it is this question that I'm troubling, or that I'm trying to trouble, that I want to sort of try to get at, for me on some level, but also I think it's an important question about Americanness. What does it mean to be American? And so the mixedness part of it, what I was talking about before. So on some level, that part of me is my audience. You're sitting in a room by yourself and writing and trying to figure out a way to get at some sort of answer. But another part that was similar to what you're saying, Lynn, I mentioned earlier that when Zoe and I first started doing research, we met all these elderly people. And the story, the P. Island story, was just untold. It was so clear that it was this important story, but it was untold. And as, what started as maybe a grad school project, then grew into an article, and then eventually into a book, and now has gone on to be a second book, I also have, like, William Bowser, those elderly folks who, they had this certain integrity and this certain pride in who they were as these Outer Bankers, and they had done this thing, and it wasn't just that it was not recognized in a bigger national way, even within the Outer Banks, right? They weren't necessarily recognized for what they did. If you go to the Outer Banks, there are all these, honors to the life-saving service and nothing to the P. Island lifesavers. And so part of me feels an obligation to them too, to tell the story well and hopefully in a way that they would be proud.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. I mean, there was one list that I came across with all these people who stood to be sold if Robert Collins, Ellen Craft's enslaver, was to lose. Basically, he's a gambler, and you have a list of all these names. And trying to, I guess, a lot of what when I was writing, I really tried to honor each of those people that I saw, even if it was just for a second by a name. And that's why I tried to name them too. For example, like I couldn't list all of the people, and I couldn't list, when I'm talking about James Polk and how he sold people from the White House, including young enslaved children. There's a 10-year-old boy named Jerry who was by himself. And just every time I met somebody on the page, I've never said this aloud before, but I would say to myself, I see you in history and I feel you in time. And that became this little kind of a mantra that I said for everyone.
That's beautiful.
It is. That's really wonderful.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I think we have time for maybe one more question. How do you write oppressors in a way that makes them seem real without allowing their justification to leak into the narrative? It seems too easy to write someone as reasonable when you try to portray them in a way that isn't an evil trope.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned this, were you about to jump in?
No,
Okay,
please.
sorry. I mentioned this earlier in a different context. But what struck me as really important was rendering all the characters as complexly human. You know, even the characters that are just sort of the obvious villains, this slave owner, you know, Patrick Etheridge in this account does some terrible things. It's suggested that he's doing some terrible things. But to not sort of just reduce him to a villain, but make him sort of fully rounded and complex, I don't know. There's nothing that frustrates me more when I read a book or I'll see a TV show and you know, there's a white hat and a black hat. You just want, everything is a little bit gray, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's so important because it's easy to hold from a distance somebody if you're like, oh, that's the bad guy, right? But if you can identify with some aspect of someone, then it complicates the situation. I think about like the Milgram experiment, right? This psychological experiment where, you know, Americans would think, oh, we would never do what the Nazis did, but then they conducted these experiments that showed actually if you put somebody under pressure under those same circumstances, they may act in the same way. We are no different. And so I think in some ways in nonfiction it's easier. I didn't want to put my own judgment, so I might have my own very strong feelings about the enslavers. But what I did as much as possible was to kind of let them speak for themselves. If you read Robert Collins's essay on the management of slaves, just like this slave-owning manual, you will see how he thinks. And I don't need to tell you anything. Right. I don't want to. I want readers to judge for themselves.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. And I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but these two magnificent authors will be signing books, and I encourage you to read both of these books. They offer perspectives that I think are important and are underrepresented. So thank you.
Thank you all
and thank you for coming out.